right. So, hi, my name is Haley. I'm one of the members here. Usually I help organize this event, but today, for the first time, I'm actually going to be presenting with you. So, today I'm going to be talking about hidden tribes, as Molly mentioned. And this is a study that was conducted by an organization called More in Common. And they've been nice enough to let me use some of their images in today's talk. So, let me get my pointer. Oh, sorry, I'm still getting used to my slides. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about today. So, one of the subjects I'll be going into are the reasons for division in America today. I'll also go into the study itself and the methodology that they used, and their findings, which included 7 distinct groups that Americans fall into according to their values and beliefs. And then I'll go into what some of the 5 core beliefs that they looked at are. And then I'll expand on this concept of the exhausted majority, which I think is a really interesting concept that they discuss in their study. And then I'll have a few concluding thoughts. So at the moment, America feels like a divided nation. When we look at the news and at social media, it's really easy to think that we're living in a world where there's really 2 groups. There's the people on the left and their media universe, and then the people on the right. And they're kind of represented in these images here. We've got the Women's March protesters and the Make America Great Again guy. And it's easy to think that they're living in completely different moral universes with nothing in between. And it's hard to see how we're going to find common ground. Now, this view to some extent has been reinforced by the media and think tank data. When think tanks and the media conduct their studies, a lot of the time they're looking at the American population using identity markers such as race, gender, party affiliation, religion, and nationality. And they're focusing on explicit attitudes towards certain policy issues, like immigration, gun control, and gender issues. And this can be useful in certain ways, but it might miss some important points about American viewpoints. There has been some recent academic work that's been using more open-ended data gathering techniques to try to get a more nuanced picture of what Americans really think. They've used less restrictive analysis, and for example, they've tried excluding identity markers to try to just get a better picture. But the limitation of those studies has been that they've been using very small sample sizes, so it's hard to know if that really generalizes. So the people who conducted this study wanted to ask, what would happen if we applied a less restrictive data gathering and analysis technique to a very large sample size, which is exactly what they did. So they took a representative sample of 8,000 Americans, and that was representative based on census data. They sent a questionnaire to those 8,000 Americans and got responses from them between December 2017 and January 2018. And then they clustered their data that they gathered from those questionnaires, not based on demographics or ideology or political affiliation, but looking at it in a very different way, using something called hierarchical clustering. It's a bit, I still don't fully understand, but it's basically looking at all of these other variables around core beliefs, core values, in multiple dimensions, not just along, like a 2-point axis, but looking at them and seeing where those data falls into groups around core beliefs. And they use this to help them get a much more complex and nuanced picture of what Americans think. Through this process, they found that there were 7 different groups that people fell into. And they started to get a picture of along in each of these groups, what are some of the core values that drive them. Then, in order to delve a little bit deeper, they held focus groups and one-on-one in-depth interviews to try to really understand what are the thoughts behind people's positions on policy statements. So let me just mention a little bit about More in Common itself. This is a really interesting organization that started in 2017. Their earlier work was focused on looking at the refugee crisis in Europe and the response to that crisis in different European democracies. I believe it's Italy, France, Germany. There may be one other that they've conducted research in. This study was their first American study. And they described their mission as building communities and societies that are stronger, more united, and more resilient to the increasing threats of polarization and social division. So Now, going into the findings of the study, they found 7 distinct tribes that Americans fall into, and that was again based on that data clustering. These tribes are defined by their core beliefs, not by things like age, politics, race, or gender. And I'm going to go into each of these groups in more detail, but I want to point out a few trends. So those at the extremes are the most vocal in the media. However, they represent only a small proportion of the total population. There's also a significant proportion towards the middle who are not politically engaged, 41%. These are the people who are least likely to vote. So let me talk about the wings. And this is the term that the researchers use to describe the people who are mostly at the extremes of the spectrum, although they also include the traditional conservatives who are not at the far right extreme. But they're basically groups who feel that their voices are represented in the political debate that we're currently having. They're politically engaged, and we see them represented in the media. So the progressive activists are the wing on the left side. This is a group who are, they make up about 8% of the total population. They have strong ideological views and high levels of engagement with political issues. They also have the highest levels of education and socioeconomic status of all of the tribes. Their circumstances are secure, and when asked if they feel that the world is a more or less safe place or a more dangerous place, they're the group that reports feeling the world is safest. And it's possible that this feeling of safety actually frees them to focus on issues of social justice in some ways. They tend to be highly sensitive to issues around fairness and equity in society. They also tend to be secular, cosmopolitan, and highly engaged with social media. Not surprisingly, this group is unhappy with the direction that America seems to be going in today, and they're also uncomfortable with nationalism and ambivalent about America's role in the world. Some of the main concerns for them are climate change, inequality, and poverty. Then on the other extreme, we have the devoted conservatives. So this is a counterpart to the progressive activist group. And I was actually kind of surprised by some of the information about this group. I have in some ways, a different image of them in my head. They're one of the highest income groups. They report feeling happier and more secure than most other Americans. They also are highly engaged in social and political issues. Religious liberty, abortion, and terrorism are especially critical issues for them. They value patriotism and loyalty to the flag. They believe that traditional American values are being eroded rapidly, and they see themselves as defenders of those values. They're more likely to oppose compromise, more likely to list politics as a hobby. And that actually goes for the progressive activists too. Those are the two groups most likely to say that politics is one of their hobbies. For this group, immigration, terrorism, and jobs in the economy are the main concerns. Now, going a little bit towards the center, but just a little bit, we have the traditional conservative group. And this is a large group of 19% of the total US population. So one thing that's interesting about the way that they grouped these tribes into the wings is that on the left, only the progressive activists fall on the wings, but on the right, they considered the devoted conservatives and traditional conservatives to be fairly aligned, partly because politically they're so aligned, their views are very similar, but also because the traditional conservatives are actually the group that is most likely to say they feel represented in our political discussion. And I think that's an important point. So this group, they also, like the devoted conservatives, tend to be religious, patriotic, and moralistic. They also believe deeply in personal responsibility and self-reliance. This is a really important value for them. They have a clear sense of identity as Americans, as Christians, and as conservatives. Their beliefs are not as extreme as those on the devoted conservatives. For example, they're more willing to compromise on issues like a path to citizenship for DACA recipients. So traditional conservatives also are older, white, and have average levels of educational attainment. And if I remember correctly, the devoted conservatives are actually have higher levels of education. So in some ways, like, you know, these are two groups on the extremes who are fairly comfortable in terms of their economic status, in terms of their education levels. They're both very knowledgeable about politics, but have very opposing views. Their values are very different. And this is where we get this sense of polarization. We're seeing these two groups, especially portrayed in the media. They're engaging in debates with extreme positions. And it's hard for them to find common ground because these are groups that are less likely to want to compromise because they feel very sure of their positions. And in fact, one of the key features of those on the wings, especially the progressive activists and the devoted conservatives, is that they tend to be highly unified within their group around their beliefs. In those two most extreme groups, the progressive activists and devoted conservatives, they tend to agree with about 90% consistency or higher around certain issues, even if those are issues that are controversial within the larger population. There's also, as I said, less interest in compromise within those groups. But as you move towards the middle, you find increasing interest in compromise. And that, I think, is one of the very important parts about this study. That's the picture that I don't think we're always getting. So let me talk a little bit about some of the other politically engaged groups who fall more towards the middle of the spectrum. There are the traditional liberals, and this is a group who tend to be, sorry about that, they tend to be cautious, rational, and idealistic. They share a lot of the ideals of the progressive activists around social justice, but they're a little more flexible about how we get to the ends that they would like to see. They're also less intolerant of conservatives and a little more willing to work with them to find some kind of common ground. This group is also very likely to be college educated, and they have strong humanitarian values. About half of them would say that religion is important to them, and many of them are likely to say that we need to be willing to listen to others and compromise. They tend to respond best to rational arguments, and they're inclined to place more faith in the viability of American institutions. And that's something that, to some extent, distinguishes them from the progressive activists. They tend to be a little more willing to believe that those institutions can be restored, even though they're unhappy with the country's current direction. So for this group, key concerns are leadership and division in society. Then we have the moderates. So this is a group that makes up 15% of the total US population. And it reflects the middle of the road in public opinion in the US. This group tends to be engaged in their communities. They're civic-minded, often volunteering, and they're interested in current affairs. However, they're uncomfortable with the amount of tribalism that we have in our politics, and because of that, they feel a little bit left out of the political discourse. They tend to be socially a bit more conservative and more religious, and they're a little slower to accept social change. They also feel conflicted on certain social justice. They mostly disapprove of Donald Trump, and when they were voting in the primaries, when they were voting just recently, they voted for Democrats by a margin of 4-3. So a little bit more Democratic leaning in their politics. They, however, feel that political correctness has gone too far. They don't like the activism and what they see as extremism on either side. And they feel that feminism has gone a bit too far, yet at the same time they recognize that sexual harassment is an important issue. So they tend, and this is actually kind of a good image for them, they're kind of straddling what we think of as these two sides of the debate. But they're kind of holding somewhat nuanced positions. They feel that, on one side, I'd like to see people able to speak very freely. On the other side, I'm willing to realize that racism is a real problem in society today. So wanting to kind of hold both opinions at the same time. For this group, they're very concerned about division, foreign tensions, and healthcare. So what these two groups have in common is that both hold a diverse range of opinions, and they tend to be more open to compromise. Then we have the groups who are politically most disengaged. The passive liberals are one of them. And this is a group that politically holds fairly similar opinions and values to that of the traditional liberals, but they don't really feel as sure of their opinions. They tend to be more insecure financially, They're less educated, less well off, and they don't really read the news, watch the news, so they're less engaged in the political discussion in general. They also tend to avoid political debates, partly because they don't feel that they really understand the issues completely. They have a higher proportion of females, about 59%, that's higher than any of the other groups. They're more likely to be African American in this group, less likely to be college educated, and unlike the progressive activists and traditional liberals, they report feeling highly isolated and even alienated from their communities, and to some extent from society at large. They feel that their circumstances are largely outside of their control, and I think this may actually be part of the reason that they're less likely to engage, because they don't feel that they're likely to have an impact, and they're less likely to vote because of that. Key concerns for this group are healthcare, racism, and poverty. Then we have the politically disengaged. Now, this group is actually pretty heterogeneous, but they fell together for a few reasons. It's the largest group in this entire spectrum, 26% of the population, and also economically very insecure. In this group, 41% are making less than $30,000 per year, and 1 in 4 have gone without food or medical treatment, at least somewhat often in the past year. So their reality is very different from that of the progressive activists or the devoted conservatives. Now, this group is a patriotic group, but they tend to be detached from politics. They also differ from the progressive liberals because of their attitude towards people with difference. This is a group that's a little more skeptical and insecure and maybe conspiratorial in their thinking. They tend to be afraid of outsiders, and they're very concerned with the threat of terrorism. Of all of the groups, this group was the most likely to say that they believe that the differences between Americans are too big for us to work together. And the researchers noted that this can be a difficult group to persuade. From what I read, it sounds like this is a group that's in many ways frightened and insecure, and they're retreating into their tribal identities in some ways because of that insecurity. Key concerns for this group are gun violence, jobs in the economy, and terrorism. Both of these groups are checked out of the political discussion. They're not engaging, they're not reading a lot about politics, and they don't participate very much. Again, they don't tend to vote. And you can see here on this chart some of the activities that these groups are engaged in, and I know it's a little bit tiny, but if you look across the top, I don't know if, see if I can get my pointer. I don't think you can see the pointer, but if you're just looking across the top, we have the progressive activists going over to the devoted conservatives, roughly arranged from left to right on the political spectrum, although that's, in some ways, it's a little bit misleading, and it's maybe more useful to think of it as two engaged extremes moving towards a less engaged middle. So if you see that, then you can see some of the activities that the people at the extremes tend to engage in include things like donating money to an advocacy group or a political organization, right here. They're much more likely at either side to vote than those at the very middle. A little bit more likely to do things like attending a political meeting and donating blood, but that's to a lesser extent. And you can see that the progressive activists are the most likely group to attend a protest, a rally, or march, while the devoted conservatives are the most likely to donate to a religious place, a church or other place of worship. And on average, you can see, overall, socially and politically, the progressive activists and the devoted conservatives are the most engaged groups. And again, you have these people towards the middle who are feeling left out of the conversation. So, during this study, the researchers were trying to gain a deeper understanding of the core beliefs that Americans hold and how they shape our political outlook. These core beliefs were previously validated through sociology research, but again, as I mentioned, they had very small sample sizes. So More in Common was able to work with a large data set to help us understand better how these core beliefs are shaping American opinion. They also explored how these core beliefs may be driving polarization. So here are some of the beliefs that they looked at. Group identity, or tribalism as they often refer to it, is the extent to which people derive meaning from their sense of belonging to a group. They take pride in that identity, and they believe that members of that group have much in common. Tribalism is more prevalent in the wings than it is at the center, for the most part, although I think that there's some nuance in that, but for the most part, tribal thinking is stronger when you have those strong political affiliations. Perceived threat is referring to the fact that we all differ in the level of perceived threat we believe exists in the world. Some people feel that the world is generally a safe place with small pockets of violence, whereas others believe that the world is actually a generally dangerous place with isolated pockets of tranquility. And the level of threat that we perceive in the world is going to affect how we perceive different policies, for example. So, as I mentioned before, the progressive activists are very secure financially, and they also report feeling that the world is the safest place. So in that, there are a little bit of outliers, and I think it's important to recognize that there's a difference in perceiving the world as a very safe place versus feeling that you're under threat, and that can shape your political attitudes. Authoritarianism, the third one, has been found to be linked to parenting style. So some research has found that those parents who believe that it's better for a kid to be obedient versus creative, those tend to be people who also favor strong leaders. And there's other areas in which sort of authoritarian parenting style also correlates with the types of leaders that you'd like to see politically. Then if we look at the third, moral foundations, I'm actually going to go into those in depth in the next slide. But those were laid out by Jonathan Haidt in The Righteous Mind, so any book clubbers may be familiar a little bit with what those 5 moral foundations are. And then the last one, personal agency. This refers to the extent to which you believe that somebody's life outcomes are really due to their own choices and actions versus luck and circumstances beyond our control. And I thought it was interesting that they found that this dimension is correlated with your perspective on certain people that we see in the media. So people who tended to be more sympathetic towards Black Lives Matter protesters, for example, also tend to be people who see life outcomes as due to circumstances outside of your control, not so much because of personal responsibility, whereas Trump supporters tended to be people who emphasize personal responsibility over the effects of external circumstances. So these moral foundations that were laid out by Jonathan Haidt are authority, care, fairness, loyalty, and purity. And you have kind of, here I've listed them with their counterparts as well, but in a later slide I'll just refer to them by those 5 names. So authority and subversion has to do with how much you value honoring tradition, honoring what you see as legitimate figures of authority. Care harm refers to the value of protecting those in need, protecting the vulnerable. Fairness and cheating has to do with sort of rendering justice according to shared rules and playing by those rules across the board. Equity, reciprocity. Loyalty has to do with the idea that it's good to stand with one's family, one's nation, one's group. And then purity discussed has to do with a feeling of abhorrence for those things that are seen as impure or disgusting. So these core beliefs affect the way that we talk about a lot of political issues, among them immigration. And this is one of the issues that's most dividing our country right now. So I want to talk about how these beliefs are shaping that discussion right now. So there's a tension when we're having a conversation about immigration. There's a tension between the desire for America to be a fully open and inclusive society and the desire for it to be safe and secure. People perceive the level of threat differently, as I mentioned. Some people might feel that the world is a really unsafe place and they have to take strong measures to protect themselves, to protect their families. Whereas others who feel that the world is generally a safe place are less likely to feel that those measures are warranted. And So the group also frames the issue quite differently. So on the conservative side, they tend to frame the issue around immigrants breaking the law, government losing control of its borders, and questions of whether immigrants will be loyal to America. But on the more liberal side, the issue tends to be around protection of refugees, the benefits of a diverse society, racism, human rights. So it's a pretty different lens that both sides are looking at the same issue through. In the middle, there's a lot more diversity of opinion, and they may be looking at the issue through multiple lenses. But the politically disengaged actually tend to be a little more supportive of extreme measures to control borders, and maybe that comes back to the fact that they're especially insecure in their circumstances, so they feel the world is a more dangerous place. So the differences in our moral foundations also play a role in our immigration debate. So as you can see on this slide, there's a difference in how those values are weighted along the political spectrum. So you have the progressive activists here at the left, all the way to the devoted conservatives. And you have the 5 different moral foundations across the top, represented on the graph by the 2 different colored lines. So you can see, looking at this, that for the progressive activists, they've rated care and fairness in gray and red. They've rated those as significantly more important than they would rate the values of loyalty, purity, and authority. And that plays out in immigration if you think about how they're framing the issue around protecting refugees, being fair. That's really important to them. But if you move over to the right, those issues are actually weighted relatively equally. So the way that plays out is that somebody on the right may feel that it's justified to say, well, if somebody's going to be disloyal to America, if they're not going to share American values, I don't necessarily value my responsibility to care for that person quite as highly as I would otherwise.
Are these relative numbers or absolute numbers? Are you saying?
Mark, you might be able to answer. Do you know if they were relative or absolute?
I think they're normalized scales. So I think the message of this is that the people on the conservative side have kind of equal weighting when they make a
so it's
decision.
relative. You got
to.
It's not that the people on the bottom don't believe in whatever.
It has to do with the relative weighting. Yeah. So these are. It's not that they don't believe in it, but it's that for them these values.
Within these things.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. Okay. So let's see. So you can see how these issues are shaping the way people think about the issue of immigration. But you can also imagine that we're not necessarily talking to the other side about the issues that are important to them. We're not talking about it through the same set of values or through the same lens. And that's part of the reason why I think we're having such a difficult time engaging on these issues across peoples of different groups, is that we're coming at them from very different perspectives, but not always recognizing that that's what's happening.
So wait a minute, can we go back to that for a second? Because to me, if I'm reading this, maybe I'm not reading it right, but the fairness one looks like it's almost the same in terms of the rating scale for progressive activists and devoted conservatives. They're at the same level. This is like a 1 to 5 scale.
Yes.
So
but
those things, they may look at them differently, but they rate them.
So it's true. So like if you take an example of a devoted conservative where the other values are not in conflict. So like let's say I don't know what bullying or something like that, where the other values are not an issue. They're going to just about as much as the progressive activists. They're going to value care and fairness equally. But if you put that person in a situation where the other values are at odds, they're much more likely to make a trade-off than somebody on this side, because they would feel more tension between...
If they're clustered closer together,
exactly.
Their values, although it's still looking like it's the top value.
Well, actually, it's a little bit lower for devoted conservative if you look at care. If you're looking at fairness, fairness, yeah, that's true. But I mean, you're looking at this is a big group, and within that group, I'm sure there's variation. And I think that when they're tightly clustered like that, basically what I take from that is that there's always going to be a little more tension for those people between those competing values, and you might, in different situations, make trade-offs that you wouldn't if it was a very different picture, like it is for the people on the left.
So did they give them like scenarios like bullying and then interpret how to map these things? They didn't just say, do you believe in fairness? Right?
So this is, just to be clear, this is from Jonathan Haidt's work, which it's been a while since I read the book. It's not from the study itself that I'm referring to, and I don't recall exactly which scenarios they gave them, but I do believe that they were looking at sort of how it played out in different politics. I don't know if anybody who read the book has an answer to that in the book club. It was about a year ago, so yeah, it's a worthwhile read, but I don't think I can answer exactly what the scenarios
I wonder
were.
if they make the original questionnaires available.
So the Hidden Tribes, it actually is in the appendix, but for Jonathan Haidt's work, I would think so. And I mean, you can look at his work on he has the Heterodox Academy, has some stuff online, but also if you just search for The Righteous Mind and search for some talks that he's given on that subject, you can find more.
And is this graph from before or after kind of redefining fairness? Because there's found out that it means different things to conservatives and liberals.
And I think that to some extent he talks about that in his book, but I don't know exactly what work you're referring to, so I don't know if it's before or after that, but I do remember some conversation about sort of fairness people can have different ideas about what fairness is. But okay, let me move on to the next slide. So one of the major takeaways from the Hidden Tribes work, so going back to that study now, is this concept of the exhausted majority. So while these tribes within this exhausted majority are diverse in their political viewpoints, they are united in a number of important ways. First, they tend to be more flexible in their views, and they're a little more open to compromise. They tend to reject ideological purity and be more in favor of finding common ground. They're also fed up with polarization in government and in our society, and they feel left out and forgotten in political conversations. Now, this is part of the reason why the traditional conservatives are not in this group, because they don't voice feeling the same way. But this is a majority of the population who in the study feel somewhat left out. So there's a lot of reasons why we don't hear from the voices of people in the exhausted majority as much as we do from the people at the extremes. One of the reasons is that polarization drives profits. Tech firms and media companies know that the more polarized a debate is, the more likely it is to get views and clicks, and that boosts profits. So the more extreme views tend to be given more airtime and also prime spots on your Facebook feed. Also, people who hold more extreme views tend to feel more certain about their positions, which can make them less inclined to compromise or moderate their opinions, and also more inclined to shut down others who voice an opinion that's different from theirs. That tends to distort the political discussion that we're having, because only those who hold those or voice those more extreme positions feel safe to speak out. And I don't have the slides in here, but they actually did a lot of work looking at who feels comfortable voicing their opinions, and that was a strong feature of this research, was that those who are in either of the two most extreme wings generally feel like they can speak out, whereas people who move more towards the center feel left out because they can't voice those opinions because they're going to be shut down. So one of the main arguments of this study is that if we want to reverse polarization, we need to start listening to this exhausted majority. Right now, this group is discouraged by our country's divisions, but they also want to find a way to move forward together. Most Americans would like to restore the mutual good faith and collaboration that are so important for a functioning democracy. But we need to learn to cultivate the ability to discuss our genuine disagreements. Underlying the disagreements that we have are differences in our core beliefs and values, and we can learn to acknowledge those differences while also seeking to find some common ground. If we can acknowledge and respect the core beliefs that are at the heart of our political disagreements, we can help restore a sense of respect and unity. So, in conclusion, today we may feel that America is highly polarized, but it's actually a little less polarized than it appears. 86% of people don't hold extreme positions. A lot of these people want to find common ground, so that's good news. But we have a problem where partisan media on the left and right show us extreme caricatures of the other side. We tend to believe that we're fighting against the worst version of the other side, instead of maybe engaging with the best version of the other side. This teaches us that we need to be intolerant of the other, because if they're so extreme and dangerous, what good would come of trying to have a conversation? And it teaches us not to listen to their points in good faith. So it is going to be difficult to break free of this cycle of polarization. As I mentioned, tribal outrage is a useful business model for media companies. And in the political realm, redistricting has meant that politicians are no longer competing for the center ground. They're competing for distinct and polarized spaces. So they don't have a strong incentive to start listening, but we do. So this environment has meant that more and more Americans are living in echo chambers. What up there? No?
We went to black.
Oh, okay. Thanks. We're living in echo chambers where we are rarely exposed to perspectives that are different from our own. And this leads to extremism, because our tribal narratives are completely reinforced again and again within those echo chambers, instead of having a moderating view to kind of balance out the narrative that we're engaging in. So if we're going to overcome this cycle of polarization, we need to start cultivating empathy for those who see the world differently. The Hidden Tribes Report can help us do this, because it provides a look at the core beliefs and values that are underpinning Americans' political priorities. The authors note that it's easier to develop empathy towards those who have different views when we're engaging in an environment that allows listening and respectful engagement. Our differences are usually magnified on our computer screens, but we may see them in a different light when we're engaging face-to-face. So the authors suggested several possible changes that could help to address the division in society. These include speaking to the values that unite Americans as a larger we. Activists can try to broaden their appeals to speak to the underlying values of those that may not usually reach. And political and community leaders can create spaces that connect people across lines of difference. And one organization that I recently learned about is Make America Dinner Again. For those who haven't heard of them, they're trying to host dinners where I think it's 6 to 10 people from different political viewpoints get together, have dinner, have a conversation about things that are important to them. And I think that's a really beautiful idea. So there's one surprising thing that happened during this study. When the authors were going into the study, they expected to experience in their conversations and interviews a lot of polarization and division. But they write that although they began the interviews with some trepidation, they found these conversations to be transformational. They were surprised to find so much common ground where they had expected to find only difference. So I hope that we can do the same. Thank you. Any questions? Comments?
I have a question about the very beginning where you had the 33% up.
Yeah.
Did that include both sides and then also the normal conservatives?
Let me go back. Go the other way. Other random slides in there. So you're talking about this slide. You're asking whether it included both sides. Yeah.
Right.
So this is the left here, the progressive activists, but then these two. So there's a difference because on the left they only have one group that really fell into the wings. Whereas on the right, they had two groups that
Is it
felt that way.
33% all three of them?
Yes, yeah, that's the total yeah, that's the total makeup. Yeah. Yeah, Chris.
Just trying to get a better understanding of how these groupings were formed. I understand that the population of the study was grouped without explicit regard to self-identified
Yes.
beliefs. And yet, the 7 groupings seem to pretty much follow political beliefs. And I'm also wondering if here we came up with 7. If things had clustered a little differently, there could have been 5 or 9 or something like that.
So that's a good question, and somebody who has a little more like data analysis knowledge would probably be able to make more sense of this than I can. So I'll take a stab, and then I'll probably pass it over to Mark, who might go a little deeper. But so at the extremes, it is true that they tend to, they're voting Republican, they're voting Democrat, right? In the middle, that's not actually so true, and it's not necessarily divided along a complete continuum from Democrat to Republican when you get to the middle. It's a lot more around political engagement. But Mark, do you want to talk about how they analyze the data, because it's complicated?
So you're quite right, Chris. I mean, you can make any number of divisions depending on what your criteria were. There are 2 criteria that they impose. One, it was basically it has to be greater than 500 people, and the other is less than 2,000 people in each group. And the greater than 500 was basically saying we need a representative sample. So if it gets too small, you might have more than 7 groups. But the actual confidence of being able to say that these people actually are, a representative sample, you've got enough statistics, gets too low. So that was really where they were coming from. And to speak to the idea of the political spectrum, I mean, they, as you said, they removed the identifiers during the cluster analysis. There are real differences. There are real groups on the left and real groups on the right, especially if those groups actually identify with a particular political position. One, I think, of the main things that came out of the study, by removing that from the clustering, it actually focused a lot on the middle, where people really have quite diverse political views, which is quite difficult to get to if you come at it from the assumption that there is a political spectrum.
Julie?
Did they have any theory as to why there's passive liberals but no passive conservatives? It's like they had moderates instead.
That's an interesting question. And the moderates are not like necessarily voting Republican. They're a little more likely to vote Democrat too. But that's an interesting question. I didn't see anything specifically addressing that question. But I mean, there's some differences in terms of how much those groups feel a part of their community. And I don't know, why that's driving their beliefs exactly, but if you're looking on the conservative side, those people tend to feel very much a part of like their religious organizations. They have a strong sense of belonging, whereas on the more liberal side, these are people who feel more alienated when you're talking about the passive liberals. They tend to be poorer, less educated, and they don't report feeling a part of groups as much as on the other side. That's an interesting question, though. Any other?
Did they comment anything about how allegedly a lot of people voted for Obama voted for Trump?
Yeah, so they didn't. I'm trying to remember if there might have been one thing where I saw Obama's name. They were mostly focusing on very current events. So they looked at Trump supporters, and I don't remember specific issues around Obama support. It would be kind of interesting to go into this and look at sort of how these groups are changing over time too. And one of the things I listened to a few interviews with these people talking about, how this data is useful and how it maybe is limited. And in some ways, it's sort of they're testing the waters as they exist right now, and things could shift if we saw Democrats in complete political power. We might have a lot of feeling of being secure. There might be more people who feel represented by their government. This makeup could shift. But on the other hand, because they're looking at underlying values, they felt that these are more likely to be meaningful trends, at least, even if some of the feelings shift. It's more likely to hold true for a longer period than if they were just looking at policy positions. Yeah, and just so you know, they are planning to publish more research based on the data set. This was just the first study to kind of give an overview of some of the information about the tribes, but they're then going to be looking at specific issues like immigration in much more detail. Paula?
So as we head into the week of family dinners for some of us, who knows if we'll enter our little bubble or not. But I think I got, and I'd love to hear more from you, I think I got 3 things that you came to conclusions about. Let me just check these out and see if you have more you might suggest. Cultivate empathy with others, listen and respectful engagement, and speak to the values we share. What might that look like?
So, I mean, I'd be curious to hear from other people too on that, but I think one of the things is not assuming too much about the values, but trying to understand where people are coming from. If we assume that we are maybe coming from the same value position, or even assuming different values of other people, we may make the wrong assumption. But if we listen and ask questions about those values, we can understand why people feel the way they feel about certain issues. And I think getting to the values is where we can have a conversation about something that's in good faith. I think, to me, that one of the other key takeaways is that when we're having these political discussions, it's better to take what people are saying in good faith than in bad faith and trying to cast them as being wrong. And Julie, you had a question?
It's more a comment. One of my Facebook friends, really like the mom of a friend, I think she was trying to tell me that she was conservative, and she said that she sent me some link about conservatives being more risk averse, and I was like, well, I don't buy that because I'm apparently a risk averse liberal. But it looks like the truth in that, and so it's really interesting now to see the studies say that the most conservative, the devoted conservatives are actually feel pretty safe in the world.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, the people at the extremes. I mean, for me, that was one of the really interesting takeaways because it casts people's positions, for me anyways, in a different light when I realize that they may be experiencing anxieties that I'm not subject to. And I think that helps me to be a little bit more sympathetic to people who hold different views, knowing that their life experiences have, led them to feel that the world is less safe. Yeah. Well, Ben?
Yeah, well, I think you mentioned it, but the thing that's interesting to me, and I speak for myself as an individual as well, is the degree to which our new media society is playing on this whole picture. And, in the past, people, I think, maybe, except for their little family groups or community groups, didn't have as much of this bias on both sides. Media, both on their phones, I see people, they're always on their phones, they're always watching TV, and I'm thinking, wow, how important is it in creating this?
Yeah.
Do we, in the modern age, attribute to this biased media problem?
And it's absolutely amplifying and worsening the situation.
Yeah.
You have the ability now to be so engaged
Yeah.
with one narrative
Right.
at the complete exclusion of the other. And it used to be
Right.
that we were watching, the same
Right.
3 channels.
Right.
And it's very different now.
Yeah, I admit, I'm one of those people.
Yeah.
I get the emails and the newsletters and the TV that I like.
Yeah.
And, I'm not getting much else.
And I've been hearing more and more people suggesting, hey, maybe it's time that we all try to challenge ourselves to read something that's written from a perspective that's different from our own. And
I agree.
John, did you have that?
I guess I did. So if I heard you right, the money is on the 2 extreme wings.
Yeah,
They're the best paid, the most financially secure
Yeah.
people.
And that was a little different from what I had in my...
Yeah, I wouldn't have guessed that. I mean, I think a progressive activist is someone who is going to benefit if there's a turnover in the world order.
Yeah, so they're both actually mostly white. The people in racial minorities tend to be more towards the middle. So it's a little bit different. I think we have a very picture of this as a very diverse group because they're fighting for racial minorities' rights a lot, and so we tend to think of that as the group that those people would belong to, but it's a bit different.
Yeah.
I guess I wouldn't necessarily agree with that, but how we define progressive activists. I don't think the money is there, right? I mean, you look at, in California, the traditional Democrats had all the money.
Well, they're a
Progressives had
small
none.
percent of the population, so they as individuals make more money, but as a group they're only 8%. So there's not a ton of money in that pool necessarily. It's just that they tend to be richer people and more secure financially people. You know.
And I think that points to something that we've kind of divided this between, Democrats on one end and Republicans on the other, but that really doesn't exemplify the whole spectrum.
Yeah.
On either end.
And I guess I would say that I don't think the media either. I think most of the media is more of that liberal media, with MSNBC, who has never saw a war they didn't like, right? So I don't think the big media is really there for progressive activists. They don't have the Fox News on really the progressive activists. I don't believe that's true.
I think one of the things that, as far as the media engagement that came out around the progressive activists, is on social media, their heavy presence. So maybe a little less so on traditional media, but on social media, very much so a presence. Paul.
So the last couple of months, I've had the...
Oh, sorry, John. I'll come back to that.
I've had the accidental benefit of getting on the Tea Party's email list. And it has been an eye-opener, because I see the same kind of graphics on the Tea Party list, the email list, as I see on the very progressive. And I have found it most interesting to read the articles. And who advertises on there. It's just been fascinating. I highly recommend exposing. It has been a real education to... There it is in my pop-up, in my thing, probably 3 or 4 times a day. It's been really interesting.
John, sorry I cut you off.
Oh, well, no, you didn't really, but I was thinking that if so many of the people are in the middle, according to this analysis, which I'm still warming up to, I'm not sure I understand, I'm not sure I agree with the way it shook out entirely, but I have to think about it some more. But there should be a large percentage of consumers of media and news and so on who are in the middle, and the noisy wings are not representing them so well. So if we have a free market for media, why hasn't something arisen in the middle, that is appealing to these people and bigger than Fox News or CNN?
I think that's a good question. They didn't answer that directly, but I have some ideas based on kind of what I understand so far about these groups. And one is that, you have to remember, these are a group of people who are struggling in large part around basic needs, especially in the passive liberals and the disengaged group. They're not necessarily going to have the time and resources to be consumers of media. So they're not being targeted because they're not available. But also, they're not likely to be amplifiers of political messaging, so politicians aren't going to target them because the people at the extremes are going to mobilize their base, not the people at the center. If we were in a different situation where politicians were competing for the center ground, I think then we would see that. But until they are, I think they're going to direct their messages at the extremes. Becky?
I wonder too with that if it isn't partly because it's super easy to present your perspective if you're on either side of it.
Yeah.
But presenting a nuanced point of view is so much more complicated.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point, because we are seeing more long-form debates in certain areas of social media that are trying to do that and counter that. But we're not seeing that so much in the news, and especially certain parts of social media which are very clickbaity. And it's just, you can't express that in so many characters. You have to have more time.
I got to run, but I was looking at my phone. There's an article on Vox that seems not very happy with this report. I haven't read it yet. But the contrary view might be.
Yeah.
Sorry. Thanks a lot. This is a great talk. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, Amy, and then I'll probably wrap up.
I just had a comment. So in the last week, I saw on the news a woman standing there protesting the Florida elections, and she's holding a huge American flag in one hand, and the other hand, she has a sign that says "Stop the Count." So I can't really envision myself talking to that woman, because she can't see the hypocrisy in that message. And so I don't know, I just feel like, I read an article, I heard an interview with Jill LaPone, who just came out with her latest book, which is These Truths, which is a history of the United States, and she talked about polarization is not at its highest now, that it clearly has been in the past before, in the Vietnam War, you're one or the other, and just various other places in the past. But just saying, like, currently, her view as a historian of the United States was that basically the polarization was simply disenfranchised whites versus other people. So I'm just thinking of that as a thought.
For me, around the comment of the protester or the person with the signs, I think my takeaway from this isn't necessarily that people on either extreme need to be working it out with each other, because that to me defeats the point, and also I don't know that that's likely to be the most successful way of going about things. It's that the people who are somewhere in the middle need to be brought into the conversation more. And I think that those are not likely to be the people holding up these signs. These are people who are maybe more open to seeing both sides. So I think I'll end there, but thank you for listening.